Okay, everybody, welcome to episode 2, season 2 of Coffee and the Crusades. We are back doing the weekly live stream about Crusades history and medieval history in general for the Real Crusades history community. Just want to welcome my very special guest today, somebody who is longtime contributor and individual involved with the Real Crusades history endeavor, and that is Dr. Helena Schrader. Helena, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
All right. So, guys, we're going to do our normal format here where we really let you as the audience direct where we take things with, the discussion. So whatever questions you have, really any topic related to Crusades history, to the medieval world. In particular, we're going to look at Helena's book that I think has been a really huge contribution just to, having a good, solid history of the Crusader states in the Levant. And that is the Holy Land in the era of the Crusades, kingdoms at the crossroads of civilization. So Helena put this book out not too long ago, but it's one that I've read and I've shared with a lot of people. And I hope you guys will check it out. There is a link to pick it up on Amazon down below in the description if you guys want to follow up on that. So Helena, thanks for being here. And so what are some of what's kind of like a general summary of this book, just to introduce it to people, if you were to do that?
Well, I set out trying to focus on, as you say, the Crusader states and not the Crusades, because a lot of people actually don't even know that there were 200 years of continuous settlement by Latin Christians in the Holy Land, that there wasn't just a series of battles or expeditions there and back, that following the First Crusade, there were actually 3 states, and after the Third Crusade, there was another. The kingdom of Cyprus came to it. And there were settlers, there were hundreds of thousands of settlers from Western Europe who came to these states and integrated. They're called kingdoms at the crossroads of civilization, because the majority of the population was, of course, the native Christian population of the Holy Land, but there were also Sunni and Shia Muslims living in the states. There were Jews, there were Samaritans. There was a massive wave of Jewish immigration to these states because historically, the Crusades did cause a lot of anti-Semitism, or anti-Semitism became worse during the Crusader era in Western Europe. And yet in the Crusader states, Jews were treated comparatively well. They were allowed to continue to practice their religion openly, and just as the Muslims were, and they had a comparatively benign environment. So there's actually a Zionist movement during this period, and a lot of Jews emigrated to the Crusader states and created a center of Talmudic study in Accra. So the book is to try to focus, as I say, on those states, as they're very multicultural, multilingual, tolerant, and they were not only a crossroads, they were an interface of different cultures and technologies, which enabled, like, for example, medicine to advance because people were bringing different traditions together and working together. Very different from what people associate with the Crusades.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are all really interesting points. One thing that I find pretty intriguing about the Crusader states is the involvement of Eastern Christians in just the, the government itself, but just, obviously there were a lot of Eastern Christians who even had fairly prestigious ranks, in the nobility to some extent. I mean, obviously Queen Melisande, the famous daughter of Baldwin II, was half Armenian because her mother, who was the Queen of Jerusalem, was Armenian. So
there was a constable of Jerusalem who, in the early years, who was native Christian. But I think one of the most interesting is if you look at, I think Stibba's book, talks about the fact that the bulk of the troops in the Crusader states, the armies of the Crusader states, were native Christians, were predominantly native Christians. There would be a small elite of heavy cavalry, which were the Latin Christians, the knights, but there was light cavalry, which was almost equal. I mean, there's good evidence now that the numbers of heavy and light cavalry were about the same overall, and in certain battles it would be more light cavalry and others more heavy cavalry. That light cavalry was predominantly native Christian, and then of course in the garrisons of the cities and also as archers and footmen, there were sergeants. There were people, Latin Christians who of non-knightly rank, but there were many more native Christians who took part in the armies. In other words, the defense of the Crusader states was impossible without the support of the native Christians.
All right, so let's jump into some questions here. I'm going to go to the first one I saw. So Alexander asks, some say the Kingdom of Jerusalem was more stable than the Catholic kingdoms of Europe. If so, was because of something Muslim powers. I'm not quite sure what the last part is, but do you have any thoughts on that particular question, Helena?
The problem is some say, I don't know who they are. I don't know why they say that. I really can't answer it. I don't think that's a fair statement, because what kingdoms, what are we talking about? Are we talking about Ireland at this period? And why? And then you have to say, well, why? Well, Ireland was weak and was unstable because the clans were all fighting with each other. If you're talking about Scotland in this period, is that because of the wars with England? What are we? Spain? Spain's in the same situation as the Kingdom of Jerusalem. It's fighting a war. It's fighting against the Muslims and trying the Reconquista is ongoing. Stephen's the expert on that. So I can't really answer the question without knowing what to compare it to. Western Europe had a lot of different kingdoms in very different situations.
Yeah, that's a fair point. And I think, there is just such a variety. I mean, like England, for example, was one of the most quote unquote stable and soundly governed kingdoms of the period. I have heard before that, and just going back to Spain, I mean, the kingdom in Spain actually had some similarities in terms of their structure to the Kingdom of Jerusalem, that they were very militarily focused. The kings tended to have a lot more of a centralized role than in some places like France, just because there was this need for kind of this strong military commander in a place like Portugal or Aragon or Castile. So, but yeah, we've got some other questions here. Lambert, where was the headquarters for the Order of St. Lazarus? How many outposts did they have in the Crusader states, and what was their military contribution in times of war? I can't answer that question personally. I know St. Lazarus was kind of
the headquarters. The headquarters was Jerusalem. There was a large leper. What we say, leprosarium, or a leper. It's not a leper colony because it's like a commandery. There's a huge building that was built just outside the gates of Jerusalem. There's actually called a leper gate that was connected to that, which had large water, and that was where many lepers lived. They were not isolated. They could move back and forth, but they generally preferred to live within the compound, which was, of course, supported largely by donations and funding. Charitable donations. And in that complex, as I said, they had water, they had food, they had care. And the caregivers might be people with leprosy that were in the early stages of leprosy, but there were very many Christians who were not lepers who devoted their lives to lepers because it was considered one of the most it was one of the fastest ways to heaven. In a way, it was considered such a great charitable act that it was believed that people who served lepers, they were like serving Christ himself, and they would find their rewards in heaven. There are many examples, particularly in the Byzantine the Orthodox Christian tradition, in which Christ appears as a leper, and therefore the leprosy was considered a holy disease, and serving lepers was, as I say, considered a great act of charity. I think so. The rest of that, how many outposts? I don't know. I have no idea. I'm sure there were ones across the Crusader states because leprosy was endemic in the region, in the Levant at this period, and there would have been need for leper homes across the Middle East. The Arabs were not as generous. The Jews, were tended to throw lepers out. They did not actually ostracize them. It was not considered particularly, virtuous to have anything to do with them. So there would have been no, and of course there would have, so there probably would have been no houses with it for lepers inside the Muslim-controlled territories, is what I'm trying to say. But there certainly were across the Byzantium world, even though they were not necessarily associated with the Knights of St. Lazarus. And you asked for the military role. We know that there were some Knights of St. Lazarus who fought at Hattin. It was a much smaller contingent than for the Templars and Hospitallers, but they did fight. And the issue, I don't know, Stephen, if you know more than I do, my understanding is we don't really know if those were, as I say, knights that had joined the House of St. Lazarus because they felt they needed, for the sake of their soul, to do something particularly charitable, or if they were men in the early stages of leprosy who then were expected to join the St. Lazarus, and as long as they were physically able, fought, although they had, I mean, we know that, as I say, Baldwin IV could ride very well, and in the early stages of leprosy was able to at least take part in the early battles. So some of the men may have been in a condition to fight, although they were suffering from early stages of leprosy.
All right, so Xenix has some interesting questions here. There's always talk of the Crusades and the Levant not receiving the support necessary from the rest of Christendom to actually achieve total victory. And then he follows that up with, what were the impressions of the Christians in Outremer on resources being directed at Spain, Northern Europe, and internal crusades, combating heresies like Catharism, Waldensianism, Hussitism, etc.? That's kind of interesting. What are your thoughts on that, Helena?
They objected furiously. I mean, I think we actually have some of the diplomatic correspondence where they were outraged too about the diversion of what should have been the Fourth Crusade into the mercenary attack on Constantinople. Mixed feelings, obviously, because at that point Constantinople had a treaty with Saladin, so they were considered traitors, and there was a great deal of hostility to Constantinople. But it was the Fourth Crusade was supposed to come and help the Crusader kingdoms of the Levant, and it was diverted, to Constantinople, and they resented that. You also get in the idea that crusading became a mercenary activity for the sake of the Pope's personal vengeance against various groups was not well seen in the Levant.
Yeah, I think I was thinking about this a little bit when I did this documentary about the Second Crusade, because obviously the Second Crusade starts off as an effort exclusively in the Holy Land, but then all of a sudden it is also expanded to the Iberian Peninsula and to the Baltic. That was the beginning of the Northern Crusades. But what's kind of interesting about that is one wonders how much of that really directed resources away from the Holy Land, because what happens with Portugal and Castile, for example, is those two kings are thinking, well, we want to take Lisbon and Almeria. Hey, Pope Eugenius, would you go ahead and give us a crusade bull for that? And he says, sure, that's great. And it does seem like most of the people involved in those efforts were either Iberians themselves or very closely involved in that orbit. And then I
don't see that in this. Yeah, I agree with you, Jesse. I don't see that in the same category at all. The First Crusade explicitly exempted people from the Iberian Peninsula because they were told they were keep doing what you're doing. And the Crusaders in the Levant didn't expect the Spaniards to stop fighting the Muslims there. That wouldn't have helped them. It would have just meant that those could have come back and they could have been reinforced in the Levant. That's not the problem. I don't even think, as you say, the Baltic Crusades interested them very much, because for the Teutonic Knights started diverting resources, and before they had been focused on the Levant. But I think as a whole, as you say, in these places where it's like that you're just doing your thing. But when the Pope, with the Fourth Crusade, it clearly was supposed to come to the assistance of Jerusalem. That's what those knights had signed up for. That's what they were told they were going to do, which is why a number of them, like the Montforts, leave it in the middle when it gets diverted to Constantinople. And as you say, the fight against the Hohenstaufen and the Pope's squabbling with the Hohenstaufen didn't help anybody. It wasn't as though that was helping the Spaniards, or it was helping somebody fighting against the pagans. It was Christians fighting Christians. And I've never seen any evidence that I've seen evidence that the kings of Jerusalem were angry about it.
Yeah, I think that the Fourth Crusade is such a strange occurrence. I mean, in some ways, but it's interesting too. A lot of people who signed up for that quit early and went off and participated in some of the stuff that was going on in the Holy Land. We never really hear much about what came of that. And I think right when that was going on, I don't remember if a treaty was ending with Ala Adil or one was starting with him. That may have played into whether or not they could have done much fighting once they were there. But, the Fourth Crusade kind of is what it is.
They did. I mean, Simon de Montfort and his brother Guy de Montfort came. That's Montfort's, is it not Montfort? It's Montbéliards. The Montbéliards brothers come, Brienne come. A lot of noblemen came, but that's not a crusade. Individual noblemen could join in the armies of Jerusalem. They could take part in individual sorties or crusades or whatever, but it doesn't suddenly change the balance of power and enable a major offensive action, which is what the crusade was supposed to do. And it did. And individual people arriving, no matter how great they were, and the Montforts were great fighters, it didn't change the balance of power.
Right. And so we got one by somebody named Taco Cruiser. He says, has the role of the Byzantines in the First Crusade been downplayed by Western sources? If so, how? I have
feel better with that?
You want to... Sure. I think the First Crusade, the Byzantines did play a certain role, but they mostly didn't play an active role in the First Crusade. And that was part of what caused things to turn out the way they did in terms of, why Antioch ended up being a Norman state. In fact, Alexius Comnenus's daughter talks about how her father really couldn't get personally involved because he was worried about things going on in Constantinople. So, I think the most critical role they played is there were a few times that they contributed resources to the besiegers at Antioch through Latakia and some of those ports, St. Simeon, some of those port cities at critical times. But I don't know. For the most part, the First Crusaders did more to help the Byzantines than vice versa. Is kind of my impression. What do you think, Helena?
The fascinating thing is that when the Crusaders arrived in Constantinople, they expected the emperor to take command of the crusade, and with his armies, that it would be a joint Christian campaign against Jerusalem. They were stunned to find out that the emperor had no intention of continuing on to Jerusalem. And that's when they had a conference, and they said, well, what do we do now? They had expected to simply join a Byzantine army, and there wasn't one. And then the Byzantines said, oh, well, we'll send you some advisors. We'll send a couple of generals with you. And then great. Well, sometimes it works. The Spartans destroyed this, the Athenians' position in Italy simply by sending a couple of commanders to Syracuse. But normally advisors aren't that powerful. And what happens when they take Nicaea, the Crusaders did the bulk of the fighting, but the Byzantines provided a fleet. This is a city on a lake. Without this fleet cutting off the Muslim, they wouldn't have been able to defeat it. And the city had only been in Muslim hands for, I think, 8 years. Correct me if I'm wrong, Jay Stevens, 8 or 10 years.
Something like that. Yeah, it's brief.
And so the population of the city was Byzantine. They identified themselves as Romans. They identified with Constantinople and the emperor, and they were on the side of the attacking army. That's a huge factor in the victory at Nicaea. And then the Crusaders, having done some of the fighting, at least half of the fighting, are told, thank you very much. That was nice. Go on. No pay. No. There's no plunder here. There's no pay for you guys because it's our city. It was always our city. These are our citizens. You're not going to plunder the people. So thanks very much. That was nice. Have a nice day.
Yeah, and the sources kind of differ on how if there were rewards after that. Like I know, like I think it's like the Gesta and sort of says that Alexius kind of just shuttled them off and didn't give them anything for their trouble, whereas Albert of Aachen says that the Crusaders were generously rewarded by the emperor for what happened at Nicaea. So
okay, I stand corrected.
well, I guess that the point is we just don't really know. We don't really know. It's kind of, we're not totally sure exactly, how that all wrapped up. But yeah, I mean, there definitely was like an element of, Nicaea. The Byzantines played a critical role in, securing that victory. And I know that Tom Asbridge talks about how Nicaea is kind of this example of perfect cooperation, as he calls it, between the Byzantines and the Crusaders. But that just wasn't kind of how things continued. I mean, after that, the Byzantines just weren't as involved. But it is interesting how important the First Crusade was for the recovery in Asia Minor that the Byzantines experienced. I know that one of Stephen Runciman's few comments I kind of like is where he says that Alexius followed in the wake of the Crusaders like a vulture follows a pride of lions, which is kind of true, because it's like as they went through and they pushed the Seljuk Turks out, Alexius was able to go in and kind of mop up these little coastal towns and castles that the Byzantines needed in Asia Minor. So I don't know. The First Crusade really shows this disconnect between this Western view of how things should be done and the Byzantine view of how things should be done.
Well, one of the most interesting studies I read is about how the Byzantines, a tremendous amount of primary sources, that's including Anna Karenina herself, who are saying they didn't believe the Crusaders were really interested in capturing Jerusalem, because Jerusalem wasn't that important, and they had no tradition of holy war in Byzantium. And therefore, they always thought that all of these people, there's masses of people converging here, and a lot of them aren't even real fighters. They're really trying to take Constantinople. And so Anna writes this wonderful thing about how the Crusaders came to capture Constantinople, but my father was so clever, he convinced them to go to Jerusalem instead, and he got rid of them. And he duped those stupid Westerners into taking Jerusalem instead of taking Constantinople, which is so much more important.
Yeah.
And there, as I say, she's not the only one who had that commentary. And that continues right through the Second and Third Crusade. And I said, and by the Fourth Crusade, it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. They had said for so long, oh, the Crusaders aren't really interested in the Holy Land. They're just coming to take our city. They're going to take our wealth. And then they finally did.
In the Second Crusade, I mean, Chris Tyerman kind of makes a pretty good argument that Manuel Comnenus pretty much betrayed the Crusaders and led them into some allowed them to be ambushed by the Turks, which, I guess that could be debated, but yeah, I do think there's a lot in his way of handling things that is kind of suspect. I mean, he didn't really want
You mean the third? You're talking about the German Third Crusade, aren't you? Not
the Second Crusade, where Louis VII and Conrad III go through Constantinople and get their armies are attacked and destroyed at different points by the Seljuk Turks, and kind of Manuel Comnenus' policy toward them. But
because Manuel Comnenus does actually support the Crusader states after he rebukes Reino de Chatillon at Cyprus, and then they jointly do the four Crusades in Egypt. And again, very effective joint cooperation with Byzantine fleets and Crusader land armies. So I'm surprised to think of Manuel Comnenus being that.
Well,
I have a hard time.
The question is, did he really want the King of France and the Emperor of Germany to come in and be all that successful in that region? He mistrusted their intentions. Definitely he mistrusted their intentions. I mean, he was concerned that they were trying to capture Constantinople, just like all, Byzantine emperors. But it's, I guess we better jump into some other questions here.
Right.
So we got a lot of them. from Zytron, do you think if the Byzantine Empire had continued to be ruled by a Latin-friendly monarch, the Crusader kingdoms might have been able to survive throughout the Middle Ages? I feel like that's one we've definitely discussed quite a bit over the years.
Okay, I haven't. The flat out no. I mean, as I try to bring the evidence for in the book, the Holy Land, the era of the Crusader kingdoms, Crusades. There are two major reasons why the Crusader kingdoms fall, and neither of them have to do with the Latin or non-Latin kingdom in Constantinople. The key factors are the rise of the Mamluks, who were fanatics and were no longer interested in doing deals with the Crusaders. As long as the Crusaders were dealing with normal Arab princes, even jihadist princes like Nur ad-Din and Saladin, they still were fundamentally interested in the economic prosperity of their kingdoms, and they were making much too much money by selling goods to and through the Crusader states to want to destroy them totally. And therefore, particularly in the first half of the 13th century, when they were dealing with the sons of Al-Adil, who were very luxury loving and not terribly jihadist, the Crusader kingdoms could exploit their dependence on revenues based on trade to keep them happy and away from trying to attack them. And the Mamluks were simply uncorruptible, uninterested in money, and once they conquered something, they destroyed it. They tore down the orchards, they destroyed the terraces, they ripped up the irrigation, and they let things go to ruin. And that kind of fanaticism, it's very, very hard. If you're a weak party and you can't exploit the other party's desire for peace and the other party's desire for prosperity, it makes it much harder. So the rise of the Mamluks was a major factor in the destruction of the Mongols too, a little bit, but because they changed trade routes. But I still think it was the rise of the Mamluks, who were not princes in the normal sense of the word. They were fanatical, fighters who'd been trained as jihadists from childhood upwards. The other factor, which I think is the more important factor, is the fact that from the moment that Isabella II or Yolanda marries Frederick II of Hohenstaufen, Jerusalem is ruled by absentee kings. It does not get a resident king until the very end with Henry II of Cyprus. And these kings, whether the Hohenstaufen kings and then the short period of Angevin kings that followed, were people who had kingdoms elsewhere, and Jerusalem was just a prestige object, a title that they could drag around. They never went there. They never set foot in the kingdom. They didn't take any interest in it. They didn't identify with it. And you can't run it. You can't run a railway that way. As long as the princes, whether it was Fulk d'Anjou or Jean de Brienne, they may have come from the West, but if they were willing to move to the Crusader states and live there and identify, they had fought, and they were a unifying force. They could keep the factionalism down. They could provide, central government, and even as a leper boy, they could fight off the Arab attacks because they were a strong central rallying point, and that disappears with Frederick II, and then continues after.
Okay, so we're kind of coming toward the end of today's show, everybody, but let's do a couple more questions. Just want to say again, thanks to Helena Schrader for being here with us for Coffee and the Crusades, everybody's favorite talk show about medieval history.
The one and only talk show about the Crusades, guys.
It may be, I don't know, but and just a shout out again for Helena's excellent book, which I have read and enjoyed, and I have given as gifts to other people as well, and that is The Holy Land in the Era of the Crusades, Kingdoms at the Crossroads of Civilizations. This is a book.
May I put in a bit? The chronology alone and the maps are worth buying it for, because if you're interested in the area, there's a very, very detailed chronology, which also includes other key parts of history, like Battle of Hastings, etc., that sort of help you orient it and peg it. There's maps of the kingdom as it advances and declines, and also of the baronies, maps of Jerusalem and Ankara from what we know of them. And which is why I actually recommended getting the hard copy, although it is also available as an ebook, much cheaper.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean the maps are really excellent in it, and also I do like the layout of the book in that it does tend to focus on on the events chronologically, which I like that. I mean, I kind of you do have like three different sections. You've got the
Mhm.
chronology, then you've got like a section about the culture,
Topical.
yeah, like kind of the culture and the governments. And then you've also got a section that focuses on the Ibelin family, just as kind of an example of a
Yeah.
one of the regional families that was part of the Latin aristocracy. So it's really good. Looks like Lambert says he's picked it up, so that's good.
Thank you.
And but yeah, there's a link to that in the description below, guys. So check it out on Amazon and pick up a copy.
And if you
And
do read it and like it, please leave a positive review on
mhm,
Amazon. It's hugely important for the algorithms. If it doesn't get enough reviews, it just doesn't get shown to people. So even if you can't write, if you don't want to feel like you don't want to write a review, give it a good rating so that it will help boost it up on the charts. Thank you.
yeah, very true. Yeah, guys, do try to give it a review, and it doesn't even have to be a super long review. It can be
No,
just a few sentences about what you think about it. So there we go.
thank
But
you
yeah,
very much.
let's do a couple more questions here. We got so many good questions. We're gonna have to do like another long late night stream at some point. But let's see here. I'm gonna find a couple people who have not asked questions yet, just to kind of give everybody a chance to say something. We've got. This is our good friend Scott Amos, who is in the audience. We can tell by the kitty cat. Um, Scott asks, how did the loss of Frederick Barbarossa and his armies affect the outcome of the Third Crusade? That's a really good question. Do you want to start on that, Helena, or should I start on that? I know
You
you and
start.
I
You
both.
start. You start. I've been talking a lot.
Well, I do. Okay, so the German army was fairly large. It would have been hugely helpful to the main action of the crusade. Obviously, like we can imagine, what if instead of just the army of the Kingdom of France and the army of the Angevin Empire, we had this whole imperial army there as well? I mean, I think that would have been, yeah, that would have been a big deal. It might have made it possible to take Jerusalem. I mean, it's hard to know. It is kind of interesting the way that Frederick's army is kind of whittled down. I mean, they're not defeated. Like they're not defeated by the Seljuk Turks in Anatolia. In fact, quite the opposite. They decisively defeat the Seljuk Turks at a couple of really interesting battles in Asia Minor. It is disease really that is the problem. I mean, even after Frederick himself, there's some kind of accident, he drowns in Asia Minor. The army actually still was fairly substantial and did continue on to Antioch. And it's actually at Antioch that there's a serious epidemic that really reduces their numbers. So I guess it kind of speaks to some of the issues with just even getting a crusade to the Holy Land was quite an undertaking. And for me, the fate of the German army does highlight how effective Richard the Lionheart's planning was. I mean, he was able to move his army basically intact to the Holy Land and, compete on even terms, essentially. I mean, well, he was at a disadvantage, but he's able to battle down Saladin and really win some substantial victories for the Third Crusade. So those are kind of my thoughts. I mean, what do you think, Helena?
J. Stephen, wasn't the Barbarossa's the last attempt overland? I mean, it basically
Yes.
made it that everybody said after that, we're gonna
Mhm.
take the fleets. And despite the fact that Richard also had problems with storms, it was still safer. The sea route was just plain safer and
Mhm.
more reliable for getting the armies across. The question I have, and of course no one can answer this, is how would Barbarossa have influenced the clash between Richard and Philip?
Yeah,
Would it
I have.
have just been a third leader that would have made it worse, or would he have been able to mediate between them because he would have had the stature to stop the two of them from being at each other's throats?
I tend to think the latter. Some people say, well, he would have just been one more um,
Hmm.
element of conflict, and I don't see how that would have been the case because there was some tension between the Angevins and the Hohenstaufen because the Angevins had an alliance with the Welfs. I know that Richard's sister had been married to a Saxon prince, Henry the Lion. But even, even that's kind of, I don't think that would have influenced Barbarossa's conduct in the Holy Land. And the other thing, too, I think is important to keep in mind, Barbarossa, I think, was genuine. He was a genuine crusader. He cared. He was like Richard. He and Richard both cared. And I think Philip didn't care. And that was, to me, that's the key problem between Richard and Philip, is that Philip didn't care and Richard did. If you had the two most important rulers in Europe, Barbarossa and the Lionheart, and they both care and they're both genuine, I think they would have cooperated effectively. That's my opinion. I mean, I
also think they were both extremely good generals.
Yeah.
And it's hard not to imagine that they would have respected each other for that, because we know that Richard was willing to take advice from the Templars and from Evelyn and other people. He was not somebody who was just intent on only doing his own thing. And if he'd had another really good commander that he could discuss things with, I think they would have been a very strong team. They were, and as saying, and Philip's leaving would have been irrelevant because they would have just said, get rid of him.
Right.
I tend to agree with you.
I don't think he would. I wonder if Philip would have left. I mean, I think that would have been such a humiliation for him to leave with Barbarossa and the Lionheart both there. And yeah, I also think that this would have been an occasion probably for whatever tension there was between the Angevins and the Hohenstaufen to be ironed out, probably, just because. Yeah, I think that the crucial thing for Richard and Frederick is that they both were true believers. I mean, I have no doubt in my mind that these were both men who really cared about the Holy Land. And they were among the few rulers at the time who did. I mean, I don't think Frederick's son, Henry VI, cared. I don't think Philip II cared. I don't think John of England cared. I think that, when these two guys were gone, that was kind of it for a while. So, yeah.
Louis IX.
Yeah, until Louis IX, almost. I mean, yeah, I don't think Frederick II really cared. I think that's
not at all.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so how about we do one more question and then we'll kind of wrap things up. And I want to thank everybody for their enthusiasm and being here with us. It's a lot of fun. I'm going to find somebody else who has not asked a question yet. All right, we've got. This is an interesting one. From Almighty 5, what would have happened at Antioch if Antioch and Roger Salerno had waited for Baldwin II and his army to reach Antioch and had won the Battle of Ager Sanguinis? Would Antioch have continued to dominate Syria?
That's all yours, J. Stephen.
Well, you talk about this a bit in your book, Helena, from what I remember. You talk about the Battle of the Field of Blood.
I know.
But yeah, I mean, I think that was a critical battle. That was kind of the battle that made Antioch no longer able to stand up on its own. I mean, prior to that, Antioch was kind of dominating northern Syria, and they were kind of on the verge of capturing Aleppo, and that would have been huge. I mean, that was. But the interesting thing, I mean, I think one of the things you kind of like pointed out in your book, Helena, is that the Normans were still. I mean, they never had, even at the time when they were on top, they didn't have huge numbers. I mean, the Crusaders never had huge numbers. Part of what made them effective was that they kind of did take some chances now and then, and they won these major victories over the Turks. And Ager Sanguinis was kind of a gamble that didn't pay off, but if it had, I mean, still with small numbers, they would have been able to do pretty well. And the thing is, too, I mean, Antioch didn't really decline. I mean, they didn't lose a lot of territory after this, which is what's interesting. It's really Zengi who started to be a lot more effective at whittling away castles in the Principality of Antioch. And the reason he's able to do that is because his territory is so vast. So you look at Aleppo and Mosul and all the stuff around there that he had. I mean, that was kind of a bit of a super state compared to what the Turks in the area had before. It was just a lot of smaller states. So, Okay, so let's actually do one more question because we have Helena here and that's always fun. So I'm going to find one that's a good one for Helena. Um, uh, not because I feel guilty about picking
No,
one that's more in my area just now.
no. I don't feel like I'm an expert on Antioch.
I mean, I don't think I'm an expert on it either, but I have done a lot of research on the early period because it's kind of a fun
More,
period.
yeah.
Let's see here. We'll do one more question. Whoever can come up with the best question for Helena wins the prize.
Well, I could come back next month, Jay Stephen.
Definitely, but let's. I'm just going to see if there's anything. Well, here's a good comment from Lambert. It's an excellent book. I'm constantly. Oh, wait, we already got that one, didn't we?
Okay. Yeah, that's right. Thanks. Put that in a review, please. Thank you.
Yeah, put that as a review, Lambert. He probably already did a review though.
Just that short sentence is enough.
Okay, how about this one? What are your thoughts on the contribution to technology and culture the Crusades in the Levant caused? It is portrayed as too much of a one-way road from east to west in popular history. Yeah. And this is actually something you do touch on in your book, Helena.
I actually have a whole section on that. And exactly that. It was definitely a two-way street. And a lot of things that normally people talk about, all the medicine, the medicine of the Arabs was better. No, it wasn't. They were using exactly the same Greek texts as their basis that the Westerners were using. And there are very clear examples of where the Arabs took things, medical innate knowledge from the West to the East and vice versa. For medicine, there's an excellent book by, Piers Mitchell on medicine in the Crusades, which really, really exposes that in great detail, how both sides, they had different strengths. And what happened is in the Crusader states, or basically in Antioch, what did become a major center for medical research and information, is that all the different traditions, the Arab and the Turkish and the Byzantine and the Latin, they were coming together and being medical professionals. They didn't care where it came from, and they were exchanging information, and therefore medicine as a whole advanced as a result of this mixing of cultures or the interface. And one of the major things that happened was the establishment of hospitals. I mean, the concept of hospitals not being places where the sick were simply cared for and their souls were taken care of, but where they were segregated by what kind of disease they had, and where there were medical professionals taking care of them, not just caretakers, making them comfortable, basically comes out of the Byzantine traditions, which the Arabs picked up and which the Latins learned about while they were there and took to the West. But as I say, at the same time, things were going in the other direction. Military technology, there was clearly things going in both directions. The most of the advances in castle building came from the West, but was so rapidly adopted by the Mamluks that, the castles just 100 years later have the same features as Crusader castles, and people therefore think, oh, well, there was the Islam. No, it wasn't. You have to break it down very carefully. But I actually do a whole section on technology transfer. And no, it was not a one-way street, whereby I also point out, naturally, if you're the invader in a different environment, you have to adapt to the environment you're in. Great example of this is that Western plows were much more advanced than Arab plows. They could go deeper into the soil, and using horse-drawn Western technology for plowing, you could take, you increased, or in the West, they'd massively increased the land under cultivation. Those plows did not work in the Levant, where the soil was very thin and where there was very little water. They had to use different instruments. That doesn't mean that therefore they adopted native ways of plowing, or native plows which were not horse-drawn. That isn't because the ones they were using in the Levant were better. They weren't. They were much less sophisticated, but they were appropriate for the environment in which they were in. And therefore, some of the things the Crusaders adapted from the Arab world, or from the East, was not because it was inherently better, but because it was appropriate or better adapted to the environment in which they were living in the East. And another excellent example is chimneys. And then the chimneys come from the West. it is really much better to have a way of funneling smoke out of a house. There's nothing backward or primitive about using chimneys. And yet, when the Crusaders left, the people in the Levant reverted to their old ways of not building chimneys.
Yeah, there's a lot of good stuff just about that kind of topic in the book. Stuff that is not often in popular histories of the Crusades. And, you really go into some of the details about cultural life, about daily life in the Crusader states. That's very fascinating and, really worth checking out. So, yeah, guys, check out the book, Kingdoms at the Crossroads of Civilizations, linked in the description right there down below. So you can pick up a copy. And yeah, we're going to go and wrap up at this point, and we'll have Helena on next month. In fact, let's just do this right now, Helena. What date do you want next? Do you want to just come back in? How about on May 2nd? You want to do May 2nd?
No.
Okay.
I'm going to Crete. No, I'm sorry. I'm going to Crete for the first 2 weeks of May, and the second is practically the first. I'm doing Greek. I'm doing an intensive Greek course, and that's the first day of the course. So God knows, I may be very confused and totally blown away. We could do the week after, the 9th, because I'll then have settled in a little bit, or the 16th is after I've come back from Crete.
Okay, how about we do the 16th just to kind of like give you like some time to settle in. So, all right, awesome. So we'll have Helena back next month, everybody, and we're going to keep doing this every week. I'm back in the swing of it. So Coffee and the Crusades every Tuesday at 12 Eastern Standard Time, so 12 noon. Okay, everybody, that's it. We'll end the broadcast for now, and thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for being there, everyone. Joining.